The galaxy is ancient, older than the memory of most of its civilizations. Empires have risen and fallen, each leaving scars across the stars, each convinced they understood the rules of survival. But there was one voice, a solitary alien survivor, who carried a truth so sharp it cut deeper than any weapon. He had lived through what others dismissed as myth. His body bore wounds that never fully healed, his eyes dim with the weight of loss. To every council that would listen, he delivered the same warning: do not provoke the humans. Do not mistake their small stature, their fragile skin, or their short lives for weakness. Do not strike them, because if you do, they will pursue you beyond reason, beyond fear, beyond time itself. The warning was not given with drama or with rage. It was spoken with the solemn gravity of someone who had seen an entire star system burn for arrogance. He told them that humans were predators by nature, forged on a world where survival demanded cunning, adaptability, and relentless pursuit. He explained that they had evolved not just to fight but to chase, to stalk prey across vast distances until it collapsed from exhaustion. That instinct remained buried in their minds, waiting for a reason to awaken. He said they were different from the other young species that begged for mercy. They did not know how to surrender, not in spirit, not in memory. An injury to them was eternal. An insult would live in their bones for generations. Once they marked you as an enemy, you would never be free again. The councils listened, some with polite disinterest, others with laughter. To them, humanity was a curiosity, a young race barely crawling into the stars. They saw statistics: one small planet, scattered colonies, ships held together by desperate engineering. Nothing about them inspired fear. And yet the alien survivor insisted that appearances meant nothing. He described how his people once underestimated the same fragile-looking species. They had launched what should have been a decisive strike, overwhelming by numbers and firepower. They believed victory was certain, and for a time, it was. Cities fell, fleets crumbled, and the humans seemed on the brink of extinction. But then something shifted. Their despair hardened into resolve. Their losses did not weaken them, they sharpened them. He told of nights when his people believed the war was won, only to see their supply lines raided by makeshift human vessels that should not have been able to fly. He told of soldiers who reported humans fighting long after wounds should have killed them, pressing on through agony as if pain were nothing but fuel. He told of strategies that defied reason, traps set at unthinkable costs, entire units sacrificed if it meant breaking the enemy's spirit. He spoke of how victory became meaningless, because with each battle won, the humans returned stronger, angrier, more inventive. In the end, his people, once an empire feared across 100 systems, had ceased to exist. He stood alone, a remnant, carrying the memory of that war like a curse. When asked why humans fought like this, he gave no grand philosophy, no noble justification. He said simply that they could not let go. They remembered everything. Every lost child, every burned city, every betrayal. Their history was full of grudges carried across centuries, wars fought over wounds long thought forgotten by others. Where other species found peace in forgetting, humans clung to their scars like scripture. And so he warned, never strike first. Never think them broken. If left alone, they might become allies, even friends. But if you wrong them, if you ignite that ancient predatory instinct, they will follow you into the dark, and they will not stop. His words should have chilled the blood of every listener. Yet, in the polished halls of the galactic powers, where arrogance ruled and old empires thought themselves invincible, the warning was treated as nothing more than the ramblings of a broken exile. They thought the stories exaggerated, relics of fear magnified by trauma. They dismissed the idea that a young species could ever challenge civilizations that had spanned millennia. But the alien survivor did not argue further. He had delivered his warning, and he knew it would be ignored. And when it was ignored, he knew what would follow. Not a simple war. Not a skirmish that history would forget. What was coming, he understood, was something the galaxy had never faced before: the hunt of a species that did not forgive, did not yield, and did not stop until their enemies were ashes. The councils of the great powers gathered in chambers that had decided the fate of countless civilizations. Their walls were lined with banners of empires older than human history itself, symbols of triumphs carved over centuries of dominance. To them, the warning had been heard and dismissed as a relic of defeat. Pride and calculation guided their judgment, not fear. They measured every species by population counts, industrial output, and fleet tonnage. By those metrics, humanity was nothing, a fledgling culture that had barely stepped beyond its cradle. Delegates spoke with certainty. The humans, they said, were bold but naive. They had barely mastered faster than light travel. Their colonies were thinly spread, dependent on fragile trade routes, and vulnerable to blockades. Their military was untested, relying on improvisation rather than doctrine. The councils considered them ambitious, even troublesome, but not a threat. What they saw was opportunity, a resource-rich species that could either be absorbed into the galactic order or broken as an example to others. And when confronted with the alien exiles' grim tales, they laughed. One voice, they argued, should not outweigh centuries of proven superiority. Human representatives came before the councils during those years of early contact. They arrived with cautious optimism, offering diplomacy, trade, and cultural exchange. Their words were filled with the confidence of a species just discovering the stars, eager to believe in cooperation. But they did not kneel. When pressed to accept unfavorable treaties, they hesitated. When asked to yield sovereignty over colonies and disputed systems, they refused. It was this defiance, more than anything, that sealed their fate in the Council's eyes. The galaxy had seen such obstinacy before, and the pattern was always the same: crush the will early, and the species would fall into line. There were voices of restraint among the delegates, but they were drowned out by arrogance. Some argued that humanity's adaptability made them better as allies than adversaries, that the cost of war might outweigh the benefits. Others pointed out the aliens' warning again, not as prophecy but as a reminder that unpredictability could be dangerous. Yet these perspectives were dismissed as weakness. Empires that had conquered entire star clusters did not entertain the notion that a young species could challenge them. Victory, they believed, was inevitable. The decision came cloaked in the language of necessity. Official statements spoke of ensuring stability, of preventing a disruptive species from destabilizing the balance of power. Unofficially, it was an act of dominance, a lesson to remind the galaxy that defiance was futile. The vote was swift. War was declared not in anger, but with cold calculation. For the humans, the announcement was both shocking and clarifying. Their appeals to diplomacy had failed. Their attempts to be treated as equals had been ignored. They had been marked for subjugation, not partnership. Yet even then, they did not fully understand the depth of what was to come. To them, the galactic powers were vast, overwhelming, but not infallible. They believed they could endure through cleverness and determination. What they did not yet know was how their defiance would awaken something far older than starships and treaties, a truth buried deep in their nature. In the council chambers, pride reigned. The delegates congratulated themselves on their foresight. They compared humanity to countless other civilizations that had resisted and been crushed. They spoke of timelines, estimating how many years before Earth itself would bow, how long before colonies would be absorbed. They calculated tribute, future taxes, conscripted labor. They saw humanity not as a people, but as spoils waiting to be divided. The exile who had warned them watched in silence. He had no more words to give. He saw in their eyes the same arrogance that had doomed his own kind. He recognized the subtle shifts in posture, the dismissive laughter, the quiet certainty that no warning could pierce. And he knew the outcome was no longer in doubt. The decision had been made, and once made, it would not be reversed. What the counselors could not imagine was how wrong their calculations were. They saw only weakness in numbers, fragility in lifespans, chaos in human diversity. They did not see the unbreakable thread woven through humanity's history, the refusal to yield once threatened, the instinct to turn survival into defiance. They had looked upon a young species and mistaken the absence of scars for the absence of strength. In their arrogance, they had chosen to awaken the very thing they were warned never to provoke. The fleets of the Council moved without hesitation, spreading across the stars like a tide of iron. They had rehearsed such campaigns countless times, and this was no different. Their war machines descended first on the outlying human colonies, striking with precision that left no room for resistance. Worlds burned in silence as orbital bombardments erased entire cities within hours. Refugees scattered in desperation, fleeing into the void with whatever vessels could carry them. To the Council, it was confirmation of their judgment. Humanity, they believed, would collapse quickly under the weight of superior firepower. Earth itself was not struck immediately. Instead, the invaders targeted the lifelines, the supply hubs, the communication relays, the colonies that fed and fueled the fledgling civilization. The aim was not destruction but humiliation, the slow breaking of will. Entire populations were enslaved or erased, not as necessity but as demonstration. The Council wanted obedience, and obedience, they believed, came from fear. At first, humanity staggered under the assault. Their fleets, scattered and unprepared, were smashed in open engagements. Their defenses crumbled against weapons centuries beyond their design. The galaxy watched as broadcasts of shattered colonies spread, confident the war would soon be over. Many species barely remembered the warning, dismissing it as the paranoia of one broken survivor. Humanity seemed to them like so many others who had resisted and been crushed into submission. But the story did not end in those first devastating months. The survivors did not collapse into despair as expected. Instead, something deeper took hold. What had been fragmented worlds became bound together by shared fury. What had been colonies divided by distance became united by vengeance. Humanity's history of surviving against extinction, from plagues to wars to disasters of their own making, stirred like a memory in their blood. Where other species broke, they hardened. The retaliation began small. Raids against isolated ships, sabotage of supply depots, resistance fighters emerging from the ruins of fallen colonies. But the strikes were deliberate, calculated with a ruthlessness that unsettled even seasoned commanders. Humans did not merely attack. They studied, they adapted, they turned every defeat into instruction. Wreckage from enemy vessels was scavenged and reverse-engineered. Weapons too advanced to replicate were repurposed in ways their creators never anticipated. Every ambush carried the mark of ingenuity born from desperation. The Council dismissed these first sparks as annoyance, the last struggles of a beaten foe. But as the months became years, the sparks grew into flame. Fleets once confident in their dominance began to report unexpected losses, not from grand battles but from relentless harassment. Crews spoke of humans appearing where no enemy should be, striking with brutal efficiency and vanishing into the void. Trade routes once safe grew perilous, entire convoys disappearing without trace. For the first time, the Council began to sense unease. What unsettled them most was not the ferocity of the humans' resistance, but the relentlessness. Other conquered species had fought bravely but eventually yielded when the costs became unbearable. Humans did not yield. Every loss was remembered, every strike answered with another. When a city was destroyed, survivors carried the memory to fuel the next battle. When fleets were broken, new ones were built from the wreckage. When soldiers fell, their comrades swore vengeance with a fury that could not be calculated in strategy meetings. Commanders who had once spoken with confidence began whispering of a foe that did not understand surrender. They described prisoners who refused to cooperate, even under torment. They described soldiers who fought long after wounds should have claimed them. They described an enemy who treated war not as a contest but as a promise to fight until the last breath, and then beyond, through the children who would carry their cause. The turning point was not a single battle, not a grand victory that could be etched into records. It was the slow, grinding realization that every strike against humanity only deepened their resolve. Every act meant to intimidate only seeded more rage. Where fear should have broken them, it instead bound them together. The exile's words echoed in the shadows of these events, recalled too late by those who once dismissed them. Humanity was not fighting for territory, nor for survival alone. They were fighting because they could not forgive. They had been attacked, and for them, that was enough to ensure that war would not end until their enemies were destroyed. The war stretched from years into decades, and what began as resistance hardened into something colder and more deliberate. Humanity no longer fought to survive, they fought to erase the ones who had struck first. Their rebuilding was not rushed, but relentless. Every colony lost was reclaimed or avenged, every fleet destroyed replaced by one larger, forged from scavenged technology and human ingenuity. What was once a species of scattered worlds had become a single one carried across the stars. The galaxy began to speak of them in whispers. Entire systems that had once belonged to the Council were abandoned after repeated strikes, not because the humans possessed overwhelming numbers, but because they would not stop coming. Commanders reported ambushes where there should have been none, infiltration of strongholds thought impregnable, assassinations carried out in the heart of fortified sectors. The humans fought like predators, always watching, always striking where their enemy was weakest, never giving peace, never allowing the wound to close. Their enemies discovered that victory was temporary at best. An outpost cleared of resistance would fall silent months later, its garrison wiped out in the night. A fleet that crushed a human battalion would be hunted through hyperspace until its crews abandoned ship in terror. A world declared pacified would erupt in revolt decades after occupation, led by descendants who had been raised on stories of slaughtered ancestors. Humanity carried memory like a torch, passing it from one generation to the next, fueling a war that had no end. The Council, once so certain of its power, began to fracture under the pressure. Some member species demanded retreat, others pushed for escalation, but none could ignore the truth that had become undeniable. The humans were not fighting for negotiation, nor territory, nor balance of power. They were hunting, and they would not stop until their prey was finished. Entire campaigns shifted from offense to defense, as the once mighty fleets of the Council were forced to guard their own borders against the very species they had mocked as primitive. The terrifying efficiency of humanity's pursuit lay not in superior weapons, but in their refusal to accept limits. They redefined war itself. Where others relied on traditional hierarchies and predictable strategies, humans adapted without hesitation. They weaponized unpredictability, turning even failure into advantage. Where empires expected surrender after devastation, humanity responded with innovation and vengeance. Where species measured wars in cycles, humans measured them in lifetimes, and when lifetimes ended, their descendants continued the fight as if no time had passed. Stories spread among the outer colonies of alien civilizations about to be targeted. Merchants spoke of human ships materializing from void space without warning, their crews silent, their attacks precise. Survivors described the horror of an enemy that did not retreat, did not negotiate, did not even seem to consider exhaustion. Entire fleets vanished without explanation, leaving only wreckage drifting in the dark. Rumors spread of human operatives infiltrating governments, destabilizing regimes before the fleet arrived to finish the work. Whether all these stories were true did not matter, the fear they inspired became truth enough. In the halls where war had first been declared, the arrogance that once fueled laughter had curdled into desperation. Plans for conquest had long been abandoned, now the question was survival. But no matter the strategy, no matter the offering, the humans remained unmoved. Peace was not an option. Forgiveness was not possible. They were not waging war for balance, they were exacting judgment. The phrase once dismissed as superstition began to circulate again, repeated in fear even among those who had once mocked it. Do not attack the humans. They will hunt you forever. Each campaign confirmed it, each retreat proved it. The galaxy had underestimated them, and now it lived in the shadow of their pursuit. The humans themselves did not boast, did not revel in the terror they inspired. They simply pressed forward, driven by memory and the certainty that the war was not over until every trace of the aggressors was erased. Entire star systems shifted allegiance, not by force but by fear, aligning with humanity simply to avoid becoming targets themselves. In their silence, in their relentless march, humans became something larger than a species. They became inevitability. And in that inevitability, the galaxy began to understand what the exile had once tried to explain. Humanity was not extraordinary because of their strength or their technology, but because once provoked, they became endless. The hunt did not weaken with time. It grew. And as the decades bled into centuries, it became clear there would be no escape, no reprieve, no forgetting. Humanity had been wronged, and that wrong could only be answered with the extinction of those who had begun it. The galaxy did not end in fire all at once. It eroded piece by piece, under the weight of a war that refused to conclude. What had begun as conquest transformed into annihilation, and the aggressors who had once claimed dominion over countless systems became relics of their own arrogance. Their banners, once symbols of eternal power, now drifted forgotten in abandoned strongholds. Their records spoke of victories that meant nothing, because none had lasted. Humanity had pursued them across every frontier until no corner remained untouched. Generations of humans were born into the war, and to them, vengeance was not history but inheritance. They were taught not only the names of their fallen worlds, but the certainty that justice remained unfinished. Each new fleet was launched with the memory of those first colonies that had been erased, each new commander carrying the legacy of ancestors who refused to surrender. The war did not fade with time, it deepened, until even the thought of peace seemed like betrayal to those who had carried the burden forward. The exile who had once spoken the warning lived long enough to see fragments of his prophecy confirmed. Whether hidden in the shadows of refugee camps, or in the forgotten margins of conquered space, he watched as those who ignored his words learned too late what he had tried to explain. Humanity did not relent, because to them, the fight had never been about territory. It was about the scar of betrayal, the memory of unprovoked attack. That memory bound them tighter than any alliance or treaty ever could. Among the ruins of the old council, whispers grew into fearful acceptance. What had been dismissed as exaggeration was now understood as law. To strike at humans was to condemn oneself to endless pursuit. It was no longer speculation, it was carved into reality, proven by the collapse of civilizations that once towered over the stars. Leaders who once celebrated their supremacy vanished into obscurity, their legacies defined not by centuries of power but by the single mistake of underestimating the species they had mocked. Humanity itself transformed in the eyes of the galaxy. They were no longer seen as a fledgling people, no longer underestimated as a minor race from an insignificant planet. They had become a force that defined the balance of power. To speak of humans was to speak of inevitability, of a predator that once awakened could never again return to sleep. Systems that had never seen human fleets swore loyalty to them preemptively, terrified of being mistaken for allies of the fallen empires. Neutral species bent to their will, not through coercion but through survival instinct. Fear itself had become humanity's most powerful weapon, and it spread faster than any armada. The humans did not boast of this reputation. They did not declare themselves rulers or issue proclamations of conquest. They simply carried on the hunt until it was finished. Their silence was more terrifying than their wrath, because it carried the certainty of purpose. They did not threaten, they acted. They did not demand, they remembered. Their vengeance was not wild rage but cold persistence, carried forward with the precision of a predator that never lost the trail. And when, at last, the final embers of their enemies were extinguished, the galaxy stood in uneasy quiet. There was no celebration from humanity, no great declaration of victory. Only a void where once there had been mighty powers, a silence that reminded all who remained of the cost of arrogance. The words of the exile lingered like an echo in every chamber of power: do not attack the humans. They will hunt you forever. The lesson carved into the stars was not just that humans were dangerous when provoked, but that they could not be measured by the calculations of ordinary civilizations. Their strength lay not in numbers or technology, but in their refusal to forget, their ability to turn memory into fuel. What others considered wounds that time would heal, humans considered obligations that time could never erase. To them, vengeance was not a choice but an instinct, a continuation of the pursuit that had once kept their ancestors alive on a distant, unforgiving world. The exile's warning, ignored at first, became scripture after the war. Leaders across the galaxy repeated it in hushed tones, passing it down to ensure the mistake would not be made again. And humanity, silent and watchful, did not need to repeat it themselves. Their actions had spoken more clearly than any words ever could. The galaxy now understood that to provoke them was to awaken something endless, something that would not rest until justice was complete. And so the story closed not with peace, but with memory. The humans had proven what the exile already knew, that once wronged, they would never stop. They would hunt, they would endure, and they would never let their enemies escape. In the silence after the storm, the galaxy lived with that truth, and feared the day it might be tested again.